This is lesson 16.5, Enlightened Absolutism. You wouldn't think those two words would go together. What impact did new ways of thinking have on political developments and monarchical absolutism? How did these monarchs do? To what extent did they succeed or fail? We're actually going to talk about three of these enlightened absolutist monarchs, and we're going to tell a very important story about the partitions, that's plural, of Poland. So we've got College Board topic 4.6, Enlightened and Other Approaches to Power. European states and nations developed governmental and civil institutions from 1450 to the present to organize society and consolidate political power with a variety of social, cultural, and economic effects. Explain how different forms of political power were influenced by Enlightenment thought from 1648 to 1815. Well, in the 18th century, a number of states in Eastern and Central Europe experimented with Enlightened Absolutism. By 1800, most governments in Western and Central Europe had extended toleration to Christian minorities and, in some states, civil equality to Jews. Definitions and perceptions of regional, cultural, national, and European identity have developed and have been challenged over time with varied and often profound effects on the political, social, and cultural order in Europe. I think they're talking about Poland here. Explain how and why political and religious developments challenged or reinforced the idea of a unified Europe from 1648 to 1815. As a result of the Holy Roman Empire's limitation of sovereignty in the Peace of Westphalia, Prussia rose to power, and the Habsburgs, centered in Austria, shifted their power eastward. And we've heard about this before. And finally, College Board topic 3.6, Balance of Power. Explain how European states attempted to establish and maintain a balance of power on the continent throughout the period from 1648 to 1815. The inability of the Polish monarchy to consolidate its authority over the nobility led to Poland's partition by Prussia, Russia, and Austria, and its disappearance from the map of Europe. I personally think a large part of it was that Poland was a weaker, more liberal power, cornered by three much stronger, more authoritarian powers. And we've got my favorite map, Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And you can't see it, but Poland is kind of like somewhere in there. Key players of the Enlightenment, we've got Frederick II, Maria Theresa, Joseph II, and Catherine the Great. I guess it's four enlightened absolutists that we're going to talk about. Moses Mendelssohn is not an enlightened absolutist. He may have been enlightened, but was not an absolutist. Key concepts: enlightened absolutism, the Haskalah, the Partitions of Poland, and this idea called Camberalism. So the big idea: royal absolutism is a fact of life. These guys, these absolutist monarchs, they are not going to be giving up even a little bit of their power anytime soon. And that's okay, because Enlightenment thinkers outside England and the Netherlands, they see social improvement as a top-down process, not a bottom-up process. And that makes the benevolent absolutist your best shot at improving society. And many absolutists actually had a sincere interest in the Enlightenment. Absolute rulers also had many important officials working for them, and these officials were the best and the brightest. They were the best educated people in the country, and they're dealing with important affairs of state. They're looking for ways to improve society, and they're finding answers among these Enlightenment philosophes, and they're encouraging and instructing their rulers in Enlightenment ideas, and hence you have this mishmash of enlightened absolutism. So we'll begin with Frederick II. He reigned Prussia from 1740 to 1786. He was also known as Frederick the Great. And keep in mind the successive rulers of Prussia that we've met so far. Frederick II is the great-grandson of Frederick William, the great elector, who we learned about. And he's also the grandson of that first king of Prussia, Frederick I. He's also the son of Frederick William I, the soldier king. And Frederick II started off with dreams of more territorial expansion rather than Enlightenment ideals. Didn't have much interest in those. He had been very successful at territorial expansion. He had made some very powerful enemies. And when he almost lost it all in the 7 Years' War, then his thoughts turned more toward enlightened ways to enhance the position of Prussia. Frederick II and the War of Austrian Succession. We're back to this, 1740 to 1748, and we've learned this. Just a quick review. Maria Theresa became ruler of Austria when her dad died, and Frederick II saw this as an opportunity to take advantage of her youth and inexperience. He took Silesia from her in defiance of a treaty, and we learned about all this in lesson 17.5. Maria Theresa had other enemies to fight, and she had to let Silesia go. And in taking Silesia, we hadn't heard this yet, but Frederick II had actually doubled Prussia's population to 6 million. Here's a map of the War of Austrian Succession. You can see Prussia in dark purple at the top, Austria-Hungary Austria in dark green at the bottom, and Silesia, you can see that's that orange piece right there. So then Frederick II in the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Maria Theresa wanted Silesia back, and she also wanted some payback for the humiliation that she had felt. And she formed an alliance with France and Russia to completely destroy Prussia. Frederick II fought hard, but total defeat seemed inevitable. Prussia was saved at the last minute by the accession of Peter III of Russia. Peter III admired Frederick II, pulled Russia out of the alliance, and Frederick II turned to other means to improve Prussia. And you've got a map here of the 7 Years' War. Frederick II and Enlightened Absolutism successes. Frederick instituted religious tolerance in Prussia. He improved Prussian schools. He gave scholars the freedom to publish as they wanted to. He simplified Prussia's laws at Prussia's courts. He abolished torture. He reconstructed Prussian agriculture and industry. And Frederick II believed in the doctrine of Camberalism. And Camberalism says this: monarchy is the best of all forms. Obviously, and all elements and institutions of a society should be placed at the service of the state. And in return for that, the state should turn around and use its resources to improve society. The doctrine of Camberalism is actually older than the Enlightenment. This quote from Frederick II kind of sums up Camberalism. A prince is only the first servant of the state, who is obliged to act with probity and prudence. As the sovereign is properly the head of a family of citizens, the father of his people, he ought on all occasions to be the last refuge of the unfortunate. Frederick II was himself an accomplished musician. He composed a lot of music. He played the flute. He took a personal hand in building and then helping to run the opera house in Berlin, and he oversaw some of the most minute details of the musical productions. The philosopher Voltaire lived in Frederick's palace for about 3 years, from 1750 to 1753. And while they admired each other, their personalities often clashed. Voltaire had to ask repeatedly to be allowed to leave Prussia. Frederick II called Voltaire mischievous as a donkey. And Voltaire wrote of Frederick II, "I was enthusiastic about him for 16 years, but he has cured me of this illness." Even though they couldn't live in the same country, they wrote each other frequently for the rest of their lives. Frederick II and Enlightened Absolutism failures. Frederick II publicly condemned serfdom, but he couldn't figure out how to end it in Prussia. He even had serfs on his own estates. But Frederick had no choice but to extend the privileges of the nobility, the Junkers, over their serfs. The Junkers were the backbone of his military. Moving on to Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, and she ruled from 1762 to 1796. She was the Empress of Russia. She had actually been a German princess, but she was a Romanov from the Russian Romanov family on her mother's side. She married Peter III at the age of 15. She had never loved him. She just wanted access to the crown. Those are her very own words. And Peter III, as we know, we just learned this, he withdrew from the 7 Years' War, and that made the Russian army very angry. They were on the verge of winning. So Catherine took advantage of his unpopularity, and she had 4 army officers kill Peter III. One of those army officers was her lover, and the other 3 were his 3 brothers. Catherine the Great loved absolute monarchy, but she also loved the Enlightenment. And French philosophers loved her. From the beginning of her reign, she planned on being an enlightened monarch. Catherine the Great had 3 goals for Russia. Number 1, bring Western culture to Russia, and she was successful at that. In many ways, she invited architects and musicians and intellectuals to Russia. She imported art and many of the philosophers. She actually published Denis Diderot's encyclopedia in St. Petersburg when France banned it. She wrote to Voltaire constantly. She sent Denis Diderot money. Catherine's domestic reforms, not very successful. That was the second goal that she had for Russia. She started a new tax code but didn't finish it. She restricted the use of torture. That was a good thing. She allowed some religious freedom, and she tried to improve education. She strengthened local governments. But then it all went sour because in 1773 there was a serf uprising. Serfs slaughtered landlords and officials. Their leader proclaimed himself Tsar of Russia. And Catherine finally put the revolt down, but with the help of the nobility, the boyars. And that changed everything. The revolt changed her attitude about the Enlightenment. Her nobles, the boyars, were reliable. The peasants were obviously not. And by 1775, her nobles had absolute control of their serfs. And Catherine extended serfdom to new areas of Russia, and she released the nobles from taxes and from state service. Catherine the Great's territorial expansion, that was the third goal. And in this, Catherine was very successful. She finished off the Mongols and the Tartars. And the Partitions of Poland occurred in 1772, 1793, and 1795. Russia had beaten the Ottomans so badly that it now threatened the balance of power in Eastern Europe. So Frederick II had a proposal. He proposed, hey, look, we all leave the Ottomans alone, and instead of carving up the Ottomans, we split up Poland among ourselves, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, as compensation for the war effort against the Ottomans. So here is the story of the Partitions of Poland, if you ever wanted to know. Here it is. The first partition of Poland was in 1772. Poland was forced to cede 1/3 of its territory to Prussia, Austria, and Russia, and here is what led up to it. There was a civil war in Poland from 1768 to 1772 between what was called the Confederation of Bar and King Stanislaus II, with Russian intervention on the side of the king. The Confederation of Bar was actually named after the fortress where this group was formed. How can we describe the members of the Confederation of Bar? Well, the Confederation of Bar lasted from 1768 to 1772. They were anti-royal. They consisted of Polish nobles and Polish gentry. They were conservative. They were Catholic. They wanted independence from Russian encroachment. And they had formed immediately in response to Russia's actions. So what were those? Well, King Stanislaus II and his relationship with Russia. In February 1768, Russia had compelled the Polish legislature to do three things. Number one, abandon all projects pertaining to any kind of political reform. Number two, grant full political rights to Protestants and Orthodox Christians. Russia is very Orthodox. And number three, make Poland into a Russian protectorate. Well, the Confederation of Bar fought against two enemies. They fought against Russian troops, and they also fought against King Stanislaus II's royal troops. The Confederation of Bar had the help of two allies. They had the Ottomans, who declared war on Russia, and they also had the French. But nevertheless, the Confederation of Bar lost that civil war in 1772. They failed to overthrow Polish King Stanislaus II, and they failed to end Russian domination. So the result of this Polish Civil War was this. The Polish government was weakened. Russia, Austria, and Prussia all agreed to partition Poland. Poland lost a third of its territory to these three powers, its northwest, southwest, and northeast edges, and you can see that on the map. Poland lost more than a third of its population. This event strengthened the Polish national consciousness, and Polish people who were sent to Siberian exile were exalted as martyrs to the struggle. Frederick the Great had repeatedly suggested partitioning Poland in order to correct the, quote, chaotic conditions going on there. And Russia and Austria had been on the brink of war over Turkish matters, and Turkish matters means the Ottomans. Both of them had competing territorial agendas, and so Frederick II's solution to all of this was bring everybody to the table. Both Russia and Austria yield to the Ottomans, leave the Ottomans alone, and then compensate themselves with some choice pieces of Poland. Russia got the biggest but least important part of Poland in 1772. Austria got a section called Galicia. Prussia got a section called Eastern Pomerania. And this cut Poland off from access to the Baltic Sea. Prussia surrounded but did not keep the city of Gdansk on the Baltic, so they had a corridor there. The Polish legislature ratified the partition in fear of losing even more territory if they refused to go along. And the rest of Europe was basically indifferent. Only Edmund Burke, who we will learn more about in chapter 19, protested this whole thing. He claimed that what these countries was doing was immoral, and he claimed that it threatened the balance of power. But from 1772 to 1791, the remaining part of Poland actually flourished. Poland still had near access to the Black Sea for trade. There was a Ministry of Education. Manufacturing increased. Many of the estates in Poland switched from serfdom to having tenant farmers, so getting rid of serfdom. Banks and joint stock companies appeared. Canals and roads were built and improved. Arts and literature flourished. The rights, representation, and protection of peasants and Jews was at least discussed. There was a permanent council of various ministries, and this council made advances in finance and policing and administration. Some people believe that this council was a vehicle for King Stanislaus II, which, of course, made it a vehicle for Russian influence. The king believed that collaborating with Russia was crucial to prevent further partitions, and he always made sure that he had Russian approval for everything he did. He even got Russia to withdraw troops from Poland in 1780. In 1791, Poland attempted a new constitution. Seemed like a good idea at the time. A Russo-Turkish war in 1787 had distracted Russia from Poland. Austria was distracted by the French Revolution. Prussia was actually proposing an alliance with Poland. And all of this seemed like Poland's chance to make sweeping reforms. The Great Sejm the Polish legislature met in 1788, and the king, Stanislaus II, he wanted a constitutional monarchy. That's what he thought these reforms should bring about. Well, the Patriots were a faction of the Great Sejm who wanted a republic with the monarch simply holding the title of presider. And another faction, known as the False Patriots, they were a faction who opposed any and all change. The Great Sejm debated over political reform for 4 years. And in May of 1791, the king, still Stanislaus II, he ruled from 1764 to 1795, signed off on a new constitution with the Patriots faction. And it was Europe's first and the world's second modern constitution. It created a constitutional parliamentary monarchy. And it created a number of government ministries responsible to the same, and these ministries had to countersign all of the king's decrees. The new government relaxed qualifications for Polish citizenship. It banned discrimination on religious grounds. It created a 100,000-man army. All of which brings us directly to the second partition of Poland. Russia and Prussia objected to this new Polish constitution. Both of them feared a Polish revival, and a stronger Poland might want to regain the lands it had lost back in 1772. So Catherine the Great invaded Poland in 1792. Polish government capitulated, and their brand new constitution was abolished. But it didn't end there. Leading patriots, that faction called the Patriots, left the country, and this included General Tadeusz Kościuszko. Before all of this, Kościuszko had fought in the American Revolution over in America. He had served in New York, North Carolina, South Carolina. He had fortified Philadelphia to protect the Continental Congress from the British. He rose to the rank of engineer colonel, and he eventually got U.S. citizenship, became a brigadier general, fought right alongside George Washington. However, none of Poland's conciliatory measures stopped Russia and Prussia from executing this second partition of Poland in 1793. Russia and Prussia helped themselves to more Polish territory. However, Austria did not participate in this second partition of Poland, and so you can see the results of it here on this map. In 1794, Tadeusz Kościuszko returned to Poland and inspired the people of Poland to take a stand against the second partition of Poland. And Kościuszko ignored the orders of King Stanislaus II and took upon himself the title of chief. And crowds in Poland were inspired to follow him because of the French Revolution that was going on. And we're going to learn a lot more about that in chapter 19. Well, Kościuszko won a couple of big battles. He actually captured the town of Warsaw, and it took the combined forces of Prussia and Russia to defeat, wound, and capture Kościuszko. And as punishment, the Russian army slaughtered the Warsaw suburb of Praga. Hence, the third partition of Poland happened in 1795 as a result of all of that. The Polish legislature was obliged to consent to this third partition. King Stanislaus II had to abdicate and go to Russia. Russia got 62% of Poland's territory, 45% of its population. Prussia got 20% of Poland's territory and 23% of its population. And Austria got 18% of Poland's territory and 32% of its population. All three monarchs, Catherine the Great, Frederick William II, and Francis II of Austria, agreed not to use the name Poland in any of their royal titles. Poland would not exist as a nation again for another 123 years. Poland was now a stateless nation until after World War I. But Polish nationalism increased after all of this. Nationalism in Poland took on an all or nothing kind of tone, no surprise, after 3 partitions. Compromise was equated with collaboration in the Polish mind. These 3 partitions instilled a Polish distrust of authority. There were uprisings in Poland in 1806, 1830, 1848, 1863. There was a Polish Revolution in 1905. Dedication to the Catholic Church increased in Poland to the point to where Catholicism became a huge aspect of Polishness. Later, Poles allied with Napoleon, whom we will study, and fought in his armies, and they hoped that by helping Napoleon defeat Prussia and Russia, that Napoleon would reward them by restoring their nation to them. But Napoleon never got around to doing this before suffering his own defeats. And after Napoleon's final demise, the Congress of Vienna, which we will study in depth in chapter 21, also did not commit to restoring nationhood to Poland. Congress of Vienna instead established a territory called Congress Poland, also known as Russian Poland, and the state was forcibly integrated into the Russian Empire. Well, that brings us to our next enlightened absolutist monarch, Maria Theresa, who ruled from 1740 to 1780. She ruled Austria in the Habsburg Empire. She was a Habsburg. In some ways, Maria Theresa was the opposite of Catherine the Great. She was a devout Catholic. She was a Habsburg. Her father, Charles VI, was Emperor of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. He got all of Europe to agree to the succession of a daughter to the Habsburg Empire in what was called the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713. Charles VI had no children at the time, but you got to plan for these things in advance. Maria Theresa wasn't actually born until 1717, 4 years after everybody signed the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which anticipated her birth. When Charles VI died, 4 countries repudiated the Pragmatic Sanction, and you had yourself the War of Austrian Succession. The stated reason that Maria Theresa's enemies gave for going to war with Austria was the supposed illegality of the Pragmatic Sanction. But the real reason was to challenge Habsburg power. Maria Theresa managed to hold on to most of the Habsburg Empire. She married Francis Stephen of Lorraine in 1736, and he actually became Francis I, Holy Roman Emperor. And both of them were highly capable, highly competent, and adept people. They had 16 children together. 10 of those survived to adulthood. Maria Theresa was an old-fashioned absolutist, and her son, Joseph II, was her co-regent from 1765 to 1780. Here is the wedding breakfast of Francis and Maria Theresa. Maria Theresa started her reign with 3 goals in mind, kind of like Catherine II. First one was church reform. Needed to limit papal authority in Austria, reduce the number of monasteries. Monasteries, as we have discussed before, they don't contribute anything to the economy. Economically speaking, they're useless. Reduce the number of religious holidays. Again, holidays don't contribute to the economy either when people aren't working. Her second goal was administrative reform. Maria Theresa wanted to strengthen the central bureaucracy. She made lots of renovations to the system, and she started taxing lands owned by nobles. Nobles are notoriously, as we know, accustomed to not having to pay taxes. Third goal was to improve life for the cultural population. Maria Theresa chipped away at the power that the nobles had over the serfs and partially free peasants. And this had to be done slowly and methodically and carefully. Otherwise, you might get more pushback than you could handle. Joseph II ruled from 1780 to 1790, the son of Maria Theresa, Austrian Habsburg Empire, of course. He was the revolutionary emperor. He instituted all kinds of Enlightenment ideals. In 1781, Joseph II abolished serfdom. And in 1789, he allowed peasants to pay their taxes in cash rather than work for it. Nobles hated this because they wanted the free labor. Peasants revolted because they didn't have any cash. And so Joseph II died early, actually, at the age of 41, and his brother Leopold took over and reversed many of Joseph's reforms. So a summary of Enlightened Absolutism. Some things to remember. Number one, Enlightened Absolutists expanded the role of the state in their societies. Number two, they perfected their bureaucracies. Number three, they ultimately failed to abolish serfdom. And yet, number four, they were supported and encouraged by the philosophes rather than criticized by them. The limits of the Enlightenment. Well, let's just take a look at Jewish life. Jews were considered outsiders throughout Europe during the Enlightenment. They were considered non-citizens, and they were forced to wear emblems and special clothing. You thought that was new to the Nazis. It was not. They suffered discriminatory laws. They were barred from many professions. They were forced to live in crowded ghettos. They could be kicked out of the country at any time. So here's a question. How do you protect yourself when society is constantly working against you and threatening you? Many rulers actually relied on their Jewish populations heavily. Rulers sometimes rewarded them for special services. Jewish bankers often funded their armies and their governments. Jews did better in international trade because they had widespread international contacts. When your local community rejects you, you have to reach out to other Jews wherever they are. So the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, this Jewish Enlightenment was led by Moses Mendelssohn, lived from 1729 to 1786. He was a German. He was an important figure in the Berlin textile business. He had educated himself in German thought and literature, and he was a leading cultural figure for both Jews and Christians. So this Haskalah movement, the aims of it were threefold. Number one, freedom and civil rights for Jews. Number two, loosening the control of the rabbis. And number three, very important, more interaction with Christians rather than less. Enlightenment ideals were ultimately unable to help the Jews. When governments tried to practice Enlightenment values of tolerance toward the Jews, the public would often become so outraged that these governments would be forced to rescind their actions. In 1753, the British government naturalized all Jews, made them citizens, and public outrage was so severe that the government had to repeal it. Enlightened absolutist persecution. Joseph II wanted to integrate Jews into Austrian society. He wanted to give them eligibility for military service. He wanted to give them admission to the universities. He wanted to give them admission to trade guilds. He wanted to remove special clothes and emblems. And many traditionalists reacted very strongly. Frederick the Great, he worked hard to attain religious freedom in Prussia, but just for Christians, not for Jews. Catherine the Great, the part of the Polish partition that she got had many Jews in it, so she created what was called the Pale of Settlement. Jews had to live only in these areas, and this restriction lasted until 1917. France. The only place in Europe where Jews were granted freedom from all restrictions was France, but that didn't happen until after the French Revolution. And we'll actually talk about that when we deal with the French Revolution in chapter 19.